Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning. Today we're going to be learning Masechet Shekalim Daf Tet. Modim l'simcha to everyone. Today's daf is sponsored by Lawrence A. Co. in honor of Mimi and Mickey Newman Glazek, grandchildren of Michael Newman Zichrono Livracha, whose life embodied the values of Torah and who inspired me to begin Daf Yomi. And by Rabbi Claire Ginsburg Goldstein in honor of her children Sam, Shira, and Shira's Ivan, Seth, and Sarah Rose, who carry on my parents Shmuel Yudel ben Osher Zimel HaKohen Zichrono Livracha and Mindel Dvora Bat Shlomo Zichrona Livracha. My children represent my parents' legacy and values of continuing to build their Jewish homes in the Jewish community. May their Jewish journeys continue to be blessed. With that, we will get started with our daf. We're going to start at the very bottom. We ended yesterday. We were talking about, if you remember, we got off on a tangent about the measurement of a revi'it halog, a quarter of a log, a measurement of wine. We talked about what you're obligated on Shabbat, what you're liable for carrying out. And we said it was if you carry out a quarter of a log of wine, because that's the amount of wine that if you mixed it with water, diluted it the way they would dilute their wine, you would get to a kos. Right? We had to say, what is a kos? A kos is just a cup, could be anything. So they talked about what the measurement is, and then they tried to translate it into the measurements they used in their day. So we ended with this measurement, this brighta that said, Chatzi Shminit Tavernit HaYishana. That measurement, this Shminit, this eighth of a Tavernit, Taveria HaYishana, the ancient, this measuring implement, which is apparently an old measuring tool, is but people still used it apparently. It was known as the old one. That's the one that you can get a revi'it halog out of. So if you want to know, you're living in those times, that's what you would use. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he says, why are you calling it the old one, the ancient one? We have something called that today. Isn't it the same? Why wouldn't you just use the one that's the regular one, not the old one? So two answers are given. Some people say, the one that we call a shminit tavernit is not the same size as the old one. The old one was smaller, and now it got bigger, this measuring implement. Some people say it actually was small, then it got larger, then it got smaller again. Okay, the measuring tool that they call this got shrunk again, but it didn't get as small as it was originally, and therefore they refer back to the original one because the original one is actually the exact measurement of the revi'it halog. Okay, this is a little less interesting because this is talking about implements of their times, which are really not super relevant for now. But, obviously, what's the complication? The complication, and this is why I don't know if you measured your cups on Pesach, but, you're supposed to have a revi'it in all your cups. But there's a debate about how much a revi'it is. And this is because even then you can see they were struggling with trying to figure out the exact measurement of what this was. It's not so clear. So there you can see, right, especially, I don't know, people measure their matzahs and there's different opinions. What exactly the size, how much matzah you're supposed to eat. This is a time of year where it's very relevant. I mean, it's relevant all the time, but it's more prominent when it gets to Pesach because people get crazy about how much matzah to eat and how much maror and how to measure it. And it's all, you see how complicated it is to figure out what exactly the correct measurements are. Kamahu Shiur shel kos. So what's the measurement of a kos? Rabbi Yossi b'shem Rabbi Yossi ben Pazik, Rabbi Yossi bar Bibi b'shem Rabbi Shmuel. Okay, now we want to know what's the size of a cup in which you could fit a revi'it of wine. Now, if you remember, we had this in Masechet Shabbat, and there we got to the number 2 by 2 fingers with a height of 2.7. It's not the same measurement we're going to get to here. And Tosfot there discusses how to resolve the contradiction between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. Right? But it seems like they have different approaches as to what the size was. It's 2 by 2 with a height of 1.5 plus a third, which comes out to 1 1/6. So it's a height of 2 by 2 etzbaot, length and width, right? That's fingers width, plus the height of 1 5/6. Okay, so basically it's a different measurement than the one given in the Bavli. Tane yavesh kezayit divrei Rabbi Natan. What if you have, now we're back to Shabbat, carrying out on Shabbat. If you have wine congealed and it's now a solid, how much are you obligated? What's the size? So if you remember, just going back, we saw an opinion. The opinion we saw so far said that you're obligated in a revi'it, that's a liquid measurement, that's a quarter of a log. But we actually said, no, you're actually obligated in a quarter of a loaf, because it's the amount of wine that could be diluted to get to a full cup of wine, which is a quarter of a loaf. This seems to indicate something different. This is yavesh kezayit. If it solidifies, congeals, it's a kezayit in olive bulk. Now we're going to say, Rabbanan de Kesli, Rabbi Yossi Bar Bibi b'Shem Shmuel, Ante de Rabbi Natan ke Rabbi Shimon. It says Rabbi Natan must hold like Rabbi Shimon. What did Rabbi Shimon say? Kama de Rabbi Shimon amar ke revi'it, ken amar Rabbi Natan berevi'it lecha sheyikaresh v'yehebo kezayit. Kezayit is always the solid measurement. Why is it a revi? Let's put it this way. Kezayit is always the measurement for the requisite amount for eating. But that's solid. So when you transfer that to liquids, the assumption is that a revi, when it congeals, a quarter of a loaf, congealed would be the size of an olive bulk. Now, if you remember though, what are you obligated in Shabbat? We said for a quarter of a log of wine. He must hold like Rabbi Shimon, who disagrees with that and thinks it's a quarter log of wine. Because if it's a quarter log of wine, then it wouldn't be a kezayit. If it congealed, it would be much smaller. So because the parallel, right? It's like analogies, right? A revi to liquid is like a kezayit to solid. So therefore, we're going to say that he must hold like Rabbi Shimon, that you're not obligated for carrying on Shabbat unless you actually carried a quarter log of wine and not a quarter of a log. Okay, and that's different from what we saw in yesterday's daf. Rabbi Simon b'Shem Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Simon now tells the following story. There was a case that happened where there was a mule of Rebbe. Rebbe is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Shemeta, it died. Now, what happened? We're now talking about something totally different. We're talking about the blood of a nevela. Let's go back and talk about a nevela in general. Nevela is an animal that dies without slaughtering, whether it's a kosher animal or a non-kosher animal, it doesn't matter. A dead animal, and it's either a dead non-kosher animal or a dead kosher animal that died on its own without being slaughtered. That has what we call tum'at nevela. It's impure, carries on impurity, can make people impure by touching it. So now, what makes it impure? A kezayit of the flesh of the animal. But what if you get in contact with the blood of the animal? Is the blood of an animal of nevela mitame? That's going to be the big question. So we have this case that happens, and as it generally happens with cases, situations, either we don't know all the details or we know the details, but sometimes those details aren't indicative of what it would be in a different case because it was only specifically with those details. So we're going to struggle to figure out what exactly the halacha is. So there was a case of the mule of Rebbe who died. They said the blood of this animal did not carry impurity. V'sha'al Rabbi Elazar et Rabbi Simon ad kama. Rabbi Elazar asked Rabbi Simon, how much? Meaning, how much blood? Okay, was it? Now, here comes his question is really, was it because the blood wasn't mitame because it wasn't a revi'it and it needed to be a quarter log and there wasn't that much blood? Or even more blood than that maybe isn't mitame? Is it maybe only flesh that's mitame and not blood? So this is a question, right? Would it be, let's say you had a revi'it of blood of a nevela, would it be mitame or not? So let's see what Rabbi Simon answers. Lo eshkach be, he didn't pay him any attention. Meaning, Rabbi Elazar asked this question, and Rabbi Simon ignored him. Sha'al Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. So what does he do? He goes to somebody else. He goes to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, va'amar le ad revi'it tahor yoter me revi'it tameh. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi tells him, it's only because it was less than a revi'it. But if it were more than a revi'it, it actually would be mitame. It would pass on impurity. Now, you would have thought the story would end here, but Ba'esh le Rabbi Elazar al delo chazar be Rabbi Simon shmuata. He got very upset at Rabbi Elazar for not answering him back. He said, well, it's very inappropriate that I asked you this question and you didn't answer me back. So he got very angry at him. Next story. Rabbebi havayativ matne haden uvda. So Rabbebi now was sitting and he taught the same situation. In other words, we're now starting back at the beginning. He taught the story of what happened with Rebbe's mule. So now Rabbebi gets asked the exact same question, okay, that Rabbi Simon was asked by Rabbi Elazar. So he asks him, it could be these are just two different traditions of the same story because they sound surprisingly familiar. So he's basically asking him the same question with minor variations. So now, ba'atbe, what did he do? He kicked him. Okay, now he could have literally kicked him, or he could have like pushed him off and said, I'm not dealing with your question. Okay, a little bit different than ignoring. He's a little bit more harsh in it. Whatever his reaction was a little bit more harsh, like, leave me alone. To which Amarle Rabbi Zreika starts asking, Rabbi, I don't understand. Begin to shalach at batbe. What, he asked you a question and you got angry with him? You ignored him, you pushed him away. What kind of craziness is this? Here's a great answer. And this is something that I know in my house we say all the time, and I'm sure you probably do also, which is, begin de lohava date bi be'itbe. Well, the reason I responded that way was because I was upset about something else, right? How often does this happen, that you're upset about something and you react? Someone asks you like a simple thing and you're like, and you get all upset with them. And it really has nothing to do with their question, has nothing to do with them. It's because you're in a bad place. And now we're going to see why he was in such a bad place. To Amar Rabbi Natan, and we're now quoting a pasuk from the Klalot, the curses at the end of Sefer Dvarim. I'll read you the whole pasuk first, and your life will be hanging before you. It's in chapter 28, pasuk 66. And you're fearful night and day. And you're going to have no trust in your future, your life. So what is this? What they're basically going to say is there's three phrases in this pasuk, and they're referring to three different stages or three different situations of a person. What does it mean your life will be hanging in front of you? This is someone whose crops grew this year, or he has enough money to survive living this year, but doesn't know what's going to be next year, right? Living in this financially complicated time, we can understand the situation even better, right? That there's a lot of people right now who just don't know what's going to be with their future financial situation. What is this next stage? Your fearful day and night. It's because you have food for the week, but you don't know what's going to be next week. But the one who's really bad is the one who has no faith in anything, because he doesn't even know where his bread is coming for tomorrow. Every day he has to make money for the next day. And now we're going to hear about this Rabbi Bivi, how poor he was. Obviously, we're going to put him in this last category. I am in that last category of people, and I was very worked up about where I was getting bread for tomorrow, and that's why I responded to you that way. Okay? Or he wasn't even telling the person who asked him. He was asking Rabbi Zera, who said to him, Rabbi Zreika, who said, why on earth did you respond that way? Right? To which he says, listen, I was just distracted because I was worrying about where my money's coming from tomorrow. Okay. So now they want to know, well, let's go back to our topic. We've got a little sidetracked. So we had this story, two versions of the story. The second version, we don't actually get an answer. The first version, we got an answer that was, it actually was because it wasn't a reveed of dam. Now we're going to see, He'id Rabbi Yoshua ben Petora, we're now going to quote soon two Mishnayot in Eduyot. Right now we're quoting one. Eduyot is a Masechet that's with testimonials of different rabbis. He'id Rabbi Yoshua ben Petora al dam nevela shehu tahor. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Petora testified about dam nevela, that it's tahor. This seems to go against what we just said, right? That it doesn't cause any kind of impurity. I just want to see something. Okay, so now we say ma'u tahor. Tahor milahachshir aval litamot mitame. So now they say, wait, you don't have to understand that Mishnah. That Mishnah is saying tahor means it doesn't cause impurity. There's two different things of tahor when it comes to blood. If you remember, we've learned about this in the past. That water, let's forget water. Let's start with just crops. Crops grow. You reap the crops, right? You cut them from the ground. They can't become impure unless some liquid got upon them after they were detached from the ground. So what liquid? Right, we've talked about this, the Rashi Tevot Yad Shachat Dam, which is representative of 7 liquids, starting with water, because water is mentioned in the Torah, and blood is one of them. Blood can create susceptibility to impurity, and that's because the dam of shchita we pour on the ground, it says, Ala aretz tishpachenu kemayim, Therefore, it's like water, and therefore it also can create susceptibility to impurity. Now, what they're going to suggest is, Rabbi Yoshua ben Petora says, Dam nevela is tahor. What he really means is, tahor milahachshil. It means this is not the kind of blood that has the capability of causing something to be susceptible to impurity. However, when it comes to litamot, mitame, but when it comes to passing on impurity, because it's just like the flesh of the nevela. The flesh of the nevela is mitame, so is the blood. So when he said it's tahor, what it really meant is it's tahor milahachshil. It can't create susceptibility to impurity. Now, why would that be? Because what did I just tell you? Shchita says the blood from the slaughtering should be spilled on the ground like water, but it doesn't say that about blood that comes out of an animal that died on its own. And therefore, that kind of blood would not be blood that would be able to pass on impurity. Okay, I see. I'm just going to stop for a second because I'm trying to follow the chat, and I see that people are asking about Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar there's Rabbi Elazar Tana, there's Rabbi Elazar Amora, there's Rabbi Eliezer, who's Tana, right? There's a few Rabbi Eliezers, famous ones, right? Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus. But the Rabbi Elazar mentioned in the Yerushalmi is almost always the Rabbi Elazar the Amora. He was a student of Rabbi Yochanan, okay? And he's mentioned a lot in both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. Okay, so that's the Rabbi Elazar that we're referring to. Okay, so now we have this Mishnah. We brought this Mishnah of Rabbi Yoshua ben Petora to suggest against what we saw before, that maybe Dam Nevela is tahor, to which we say maybe it means tahor that it didn't, wait 1 second. Yeah, right, okay, let me finish my sentence and then I'm going to go back to the chat. But maybe it means tahor that it didn't create susceptibility to impurity. That might be what it means, and not that it's actually tahor. So I see you're saying that we started with Rabbi Eliezer. I assume that it's a girsa problem, and we really started with Rabbi Elazar. I'm not sure where we see we started with Rabbi Eliezer. No, I think we started with Rabbi Elazar. If I said it by mistake, Rabbi Eliezer, whoops, sorry, it should have been Rabbi Elazar. So yeah, it's a mistake. You have Rabbi Eliezer in your text, but it should be Rabbi Elazar. It's a mistake. So Rabbi Elazar asked Rabbi Simon, not Rabbi Eliezer. No, I think that's a mistake in your text. In my text, it says Rabbi Elazar. Okay, so just to clarify, it's Rabbi Elazar through and through. Okay, now we're going to get to, so we have this Mishnah of Rabbi Yoshua ben Petora. We move on, so we say, maybe this Mishnah is referring to susceptibility to impurity and not to what we thought before of that it doesn't pass on any kind of impurity. So now we're going to say, okay, so that's our suggestion. So now we say, but wait, Taman Tanina, and there's a Mishnah that says, so we're now going to make this split. It doesn't create susceptibility to impurity, but it does pass on impurity. Those are two very different things, right? Everybody understands. One is if it got onto something, then that item can now be susceptible to impurity. The other is if it itself is impure, right? There it doesn't even need to be impure. That it's irrelevant if it's impure or not. It's just a liquid that could cause something else to, if someone then were to come who was impure and touch it, that item would then become impure. The other is, does it pass on impurity? So we're going to try to suggest maybe he meant not that it passed on, that it could pass on impurity, again, assuming you have a revi'it of blood. To which they say, but wait, Taman Tanina, there's a Mishnah that says, Dam hasheretz kivsaro, the blood of a sheretz, one of the creepy crawlers, those 8 shratzim that we've learned about before, is kivsaro, is just like its flesh. Mitame ve'eno machshir, passes on impurity, but it doesn't create susceptibility to impurity. First of all, this looks good right now. We're showing there could be a split between these things. But now they say, ve'en lanu kayotze bo, but we have nothing else like this. Oh, if we have nothing else like this, then how could we possibly suggest that the blood of a nevela is the same? How could it possibly be? It just says there's nothing else like this. To which they answer, no. This ein lanu kayotze bo could be understood to be referring to something else, which is shiur tumato shedamo mitamei kivsaro. What's the shiur of tumah when it comes to sheretz? It's different than the others. We've actually learned this before. I don't know if you remember. It's the size of an adasha, the size of a lentil, which is a very small amount. So that's what we're saying is unique to sheretz and not to anything else, in which case we could still explain Rabbi Yoshua ben Petora is saying tahor means it's tahor, that it doesn't create susceptibility to impurity, even though it itself, if it's blood of a nevela, could make something tameh, assuming you have a revi'it. What was unique about sheretz is that it's a much smaller amount of blood. Right, the amount of a lentil is teeny. Okay, so next, Amar Rabbi Yossi. But now it's not so clear how Rabbi Yehoshua ben Patora explains it. It could be he really means tahor. There is no impurity at all. So now we're going to say, Plige batrei amoraim. There's two amoraim who debate exactly what the halacha is with the stam nevela. Chad amar tameh, v'chad amar tahor. One says it's impure and one says it's pure. One says it does pass on impurity. One says it doesn't. Forgetting that susceptibility. Now we're just talking about, is it impure? Manda amar tameh ki Rabbi Yehuda, who we haven't yet seen. I'll show you him in a minute. It's not going to be in the Gemara, but they're assuming you know this. It's actually part of a famous Mishnah, but you might not know it. I will tell you in a minute. Umanda amar tahor ki Rabbi Yehoshua ben Patora. So now we're going to say, okay, well, in chapter 8 of Eduyot, we saw Rabbi Yehoshua ben Patora. He says dam nevela is tahor. Now they're taking it literally. He means tahor. It's really impure. It's really pure. It can't pass on impurity. Now I'm going to read you from chapter 5 in Eduyot, the first Mishnah. You'll see in a minute why it's a famous Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shisha dvarim mikulei Beit Shammai u'michumurei Beit Hillel. We all know that Beit Hillel is always more lenient. Beit Shammai is always more stringent. However, there's 6 exceptions. That's why this is famous, where Beit Shammai is more lenient and Beit Hillel is more stringent. And the first one is our case. Dam nevelot, Beit Shammai mitaharin, Beit Hillel mitamim. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, Beit Hillel is mitame dam nevela. There you see it. And he obviously holds like Beit Hillel, because we always hold like Beit Hillel. In which case you're going to say, dam nevela, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is tahor, is tameh. And according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Patora, it's tahor. And that's why one Amora says like him and one Amora says like him. So we end up with a machloket about this. Okay, 2 different approaches, and they obviously don't say which one we hold by. Amalei Ravam Duma Nechuta v'yeot. Rabbi Yehuda Moraina de Benesia have. It makes sense that Rabbi Yehuda says this. Why? Now, don't confuse Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, I know you were confused before with Rabbi Elazar, who he was. Rabbi Yehuda is also right. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Eliezer, they're names that come up all the time, and there's a whole bunch of different people with that name. Likewise, Rabbi Yehuda, there's a lot of different people with that name. The most famous is Rabbi Yehuda Stam, who's Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli, who was the rabbi of the house of the Nasi. Now, the Nasi was Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. He was Rabbi Yehuda the Nasi. Now, that's 2 different people. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is the one who was attributed the editing job of the Mishnah, of compiling the Mishnah. So now they say the story happened, Ma'aseh Rebbe. Rebbe is how they refer to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. The story happened in Rebbe's house. And what did we say? The way we understood the story to be was that he said it was tahor only because it didn't have a revi'it of dam. But if it had a revi'it of dam, it would have been tameh. That matches Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli, who was the rabbi of the house of the Nasi. So it makes sense that he's the one who says tameh. And it's Rabbi Yehoshua ben Patora who says tahor. And therefore, everything fits in nicely, going back to the beginning of the story. Now we're getting back to where we started in our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, we discussed this issue of being suspect of somebody entering the temple, right? If they're going to go into the treasury, the person who's toremet halishka, right, who does it, we're always worried that maybe they'll take something, they can't have a folded garment, they can't have shoes on in case they might steal the money. So now we're going to talk about this a little more. Shema yani v'yomru, right? This was the quote from the Mishnah. Maybe they'll get poor, and then people will say, oh, he must have, the reason he got punished was because he must have stolen money. Or maybe he got rich, and then we'd say, oh, he got rich because he took money. Tameh Rabbi Yishmael. If you have curly hair, you can't be, okay, you might think interesting reasons to passel someone from a job, right? You say discrimination, I'm a woman, I can't get this job, or whatever, I can't get this job. If you have curly hair, you can't get this job. Why? Because you're suspect that you'll hide money in your curls. It sounds a little bit strange. Why would be hiding? How do you hide money in curls? It's not like money's really going to stay in your curls. So wait 1 minute. We'll get back to it. Tane, there's another bright tag. If someone did it, actually, there's different interpretations here. Some people say they would basically, if you had curly hair and you did it anyway, they would check through your hair when you would get out. They would kind of straighten your hair to make sure, right here you hear about hair straightening. Those curly people like to straighten their hair, that they would do it to make sure you didn't hide anything in your hair. Tane, not only that, they would make sure he was talking the whole time he went in. Why? Because maybe he'll put money in his mouth, right? First of all, right, like My Fair Lady, the marbles in her mouth and she sounded all garbled, right? If you have money in your mouth, you would sound funny. So they would be able to know if you were putting money in your mouth. So then they say, why don't we have an easier solution? Yimale pimi moi. Why don't you just put water into your mouth and have him have water in his mouth? Now that would be impossible because there's a bracha you would say when you're tolem talishka. Now we learn. It's funny how they learn it. They don't say it straight on. They just say, "Oh, can't put water in your mouth because there's this bracha that you say." And you make a bracha when you're doing tolem talishka. Right? Ruth is pointing out the other translation. Kilkin is also, it could be that the wool there was a concern they would hide it in the wool of their garments. Okay, I want to read from this book. Professor Saul Lieberman has a book called Hellenism in Jewish Palestine. And he talks about, very interesting, he quotes, I'll just read it because it's so great. Says here, all these precautions remind us, he's talking about our Mishnah and these other sources about the hair and everything, and he's going to get to specifically the hair. All these precautions remind us of the anecdote told by Herodotus about Alcmian, who Croesus permitted to take out of his treasury as much gold as he could carry on his person. The former put on a wide tunic, leaving a deep fold in it, sound familiar? And shot himself with the most spacious buskins he could find. He then packed the fold of his tunic and his buskins with gold dust. Notice, gold dust. Okay, we were talking about putting money in your hair. So it seems like the gold dust. So he says here, in addition, he strewed dust in the hair of his head and took more of it in his mouth. Notice the connection here. The injunction on a man, despite with long curly hair, not to enter the treasury chamber could make sense only if the chamber contained gold dust. Right? So it seems, and what's interesting here is that it's very likely that the rabbis knew about this story, and therefore all the things that they're talking about match the story of someone who took something out of the treasury, hiding it in all sorts of ways. And in that case, he didn't have to hide it because he was allowed to. But you see how you could put on your body all sorts of things, and from there, all these details totally match that story. So it's great. This is what shows you the importance, right? If we had the time to really read all these different things and learn, how much more it would shed light on the rabbis' world and how they knew this literature and they knew this story and they used that in their commentaries and their halachot. It's very interesting. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yonatan says, "B'Torah u'b'Nevi'im u'b'Chtuvim matzanu she'adam tzarich latzeit yidei habriot kederech shu tzarich latzeit yidei hamakom." This is going back to the Mishnah. We saw 2 verses. Now we're going to see 3 that discuss how important it is not to arouse any kind of suspicion among other people. So b'Torah minayim, so he says one in the Torah, one in the prophets, and one in the writings. B'Torah minayin dechtiv v'yitem nikiyim me'Hashem u'miYisrael. That's the one we saw. You have to be clean from God and from people. B'Nevi'im minayin. Where do we get it from the Nevi'im? This is a pasuk from Yoshua. El Elohim Hashem v'Yisrael hu yada. Okay, he doesn't quote the whole thing, but it says basically, right, God knows and the Jewish people know. In other words, make sure that people who don't, people don't suspect you of other things. B'Ktuvim minayin. What about in the writings? Right. This is a verse from Mishlei, from Proverbs, that you should find favor in everybody's eyes. So now they say, Gamliel Zoga Sha'al Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Bun, Ezewan Bechuvar Shebekulam, which is the most clear out of all of them. Amar Le V'item Nikiyim Hashem Yisrael. That's the one that's the most obvious, that clearly is talking about our Mishnah, which is try to stay as clean as you can from arousing any suspicion. We get back at the very end of our chapter, at the end of this daf, to this idea of Nikiyim. So keep it in mind. Next Mishnah. Now we're going to get to some nitty-gritty details and some specific things that happen, particularly with the house of Rabban Gamliel. Shel Rabban Gamliel haya nichnas v'shiklo bein etzba'otav v'zorko lifnei hatorem v'hatorem mitkaven v'tochafo l'toch hakupa. The house of Rabban Gamliel, they had this custom. They would walk in with their shekalim to the temple treasury chamber. They would throw their shekel at the person who was the one who was torem et halishka. I guess they would come in on the last day, and while they were doing it, or maybe that person was around other times, I don't know. They would put it in front of him, and he himself would put it into the kupa. They wanted him to know exactly which coin was theirs, so that he used their coin to buy things. We're going to talk about this later. Why? What's the difference? So we'll get to that in the Gemara. Ein hatorem torem ad shu omer lahem etrom, vehem omrim lo trom 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 shalosh pa'amim. There was a ceremony kind of thing, and this we see, for example, by the Korban HaOmer, which was done yesterday in the temple, where they would go out and they would cut it and they would say magal zo, magal zo, magal zo, and there was a whole repetition of 3 things. Kiddush HaChodesh, when they said, I saw the new moon, they do a whole ceremony of, they say things 3 times. Our hadrons, we say 3 times, right? Hataran Nedarim, we do 3 times. It's all sorts of things. So here also, he says to them, should I Should I go for it? And they say, yes, 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 right? They basically say, trom, 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 do the Truma Halishka, which again, we're going to see exactly what that means right now. Taram et harishona. So remember what he does? He takes the money that was brought, and he puts it into these 3 kupot. We said they're written Aleph Bet Gimel or Alphabet Gamma on each one. But what we're going to learn now is there were 3 gigantic kupot. First, all the money was collected in these 3 big boxes or chambers or whatever you would call them. So he would take, now we're going to learn, they would take Taram et harishona. They do the Truma Halishka 3 times. Each time they do it, they're going to take money from a basket that was collected in. They're going to split it into 3 with 3 se'ah in each. They might have left over from where they took the money from, because it could be there was more than what they actually needed. So there were basically these 3 big ones. Each time, each date, remember we saw there were 3 different dates, they would take from a different one. So they would start with 1. They would take from there on the 1st of Nisan, split it into 3, and then they would cover whatever was left. There could have been money left. They would cover it with this katavlaot. It's like a leather strip of something. They would cover it with this leather cover. Hashniya. So now, when they get to the second Trumat Halishka, the second date, whether it's a Chab Sivan or whatever date it might be, right, there was a debate. So they would get to that one. Again, they would cover it. What's the issue? They wanted, when they came back the second time and the third time, they didn't want people to mistakenly take from the wrong one. Because what happens is when you take the money from that basket, then whatever's left is called shiraim. That's the remainders. You can't use that anymore to buy the sacrifices. So therefore, that's what they would do. Okay, the next Mishnah is going to be in the beginning of the next parak, what they would buy with all the money, what they would buy with the remainder, what they would use all the monies for. So now that's for tomorrow. So then they would say the hashlishit, then they would take from the third, lo hayam chapeh. But then there was no point to cover it up because we're already finished. That was the last Trumat Halishka. There is no other one after that. But lama hayam chapeh, what was the reason? They didn't want to forget that they already took from there, and therefore they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it from something that was already taken. Okay, that's what I talked about, the remainder. Taram et harishona l'shem eretz Yisrael, v'hashniya l'shem krachim hamukafim la, v'hashlishit l'shem Bavel, u'l'shem Madai, u'l'shem medinot harechokot. Each one was representative of a different group of people, and it makes sense because the later ones, right? The first one was people in Israel, because those were the people who had enough time to get there from Adar till the beginning of Nisan. The people who live farther away, the surrounding areas, would be the second one, would be representative. And it seems even like they would take the money, they would put it in different baskets even. It wasn't just representative, I think, the way I understand it, and we'll see this later, it seems clear from a Braita, that the first monies from the people in Israel, they would put their money in one kupa. The people from the surrounding areas would put it in the next. And the people from Bavel and Madai and the farther away places, they would bring it to and put it in the third kupa. Okay, Shobek Rabban Gamliel. Now we're going to start in the Gemara with Rabban Gamliel. I don't understand why you did this whole thing. Why does he have to see your shekel and your shekel goes? It doesn't matter if they take your shekel or not. In the end, it's just like truma. When I have truma, what happens? I take all my crops. I can have 2 piles. I take from one pile. It takes care of the truma even in the other pile, even though I didn't take anything from that pile. So what's the difference if they took your money or not? It works for truma. It should work for here also. This is all representative of, my money was in here. And that's why they specifically want to take from all the money from each different kupa so that everyone feels like their money gets covered. Okay, so what's the difference? So hanachat ruach ilahem shelo yehi korban mitkarev ela mishelahem tchila. It was just to make them feel better. It was important for them that their sacrifice was taken, right? That if they wanted to feel like their money went directly to the sacrifice, but it wasn't necessary halachically. It's just to make Rabban Gamliel feel better. This, by the way, we've seen Rabban Gamliel. He's a little bit, right? He wants power, and he likes things done his way, and but he also was kind of deserving of the respect. He came from the family of the Nisiim, so it makes sense that they would give him respect in this way. Tane. Shamat takatavlaot nasu kulan shiraim. What if you cover them, but now all of a sudden someone uncovers it. Now we no longer know which one did they take the money from or not. So now we're stuck because nasu kulam shirayim. Everything becomes remainders. And remainders, you can't buy the sacrifices using the remainders. Tane, another bright about this. Shlishit. Hi aita ashira shebekulam. The third one had the most, no, it's unclear exactly. Maybe had the most money. Now remember, this came from Babylonia. This is like classic, right? The tzedakah is more, right? You could get much more tzedakah outside of Israel than in Israel, right? And also makes sense in those times. The Babylonians were very wealthy. In Israel, things were not good and they didn't have as much wealth as the Babylonians did. Things were very solid there. There was good economy. So their money, they brought more money, possibly. Again, you can't say they brought more money because everybody brought a machatzit shekel. So either we're going to explain in the Gemara in a bit different way. I'm just sort of suggesting also maybe there were more people. So maybe there was more money coming from there. Obviously, it depends what time period you're talking about. In that time period, not so much really. So we'll have to explain it in a different way, which is the way the Gemara explains it, which is they would be able to turn their money into bigger coins. So what we're going to say in the end is that they had these better coins there because they would transfer their money because it was hard to bring from far away. So they would transfer them according to the Mishnah. It said darkonot. Here we're going to see that they did it also in other ways. Shayuba istariot shel zahav v'darkonot shel zahav. Okay, this had the more quality money because they would transfer all the small coins, so they wouldn't have to schlep them so far into these bigger darkonot, and these istariot of zahav. Okay, these golden coins. Tani. So it seems like it doesn't mean they had more money. It doesn't mean it. It just had these better quality coins. Tani. Another bright about this. Taramat harishona l'shem Eretz Yisrael u'l'shem Kol Yisrael. So the first one, again, we already said this. The first time they do the Truma Lishka, it's in the name of Israel and all the people living in Israel. Shnia l'shem. This is obviously somewhat symbolic. Again, could be also they're taking the money only from those in Israel. But it's obviously representative of everybody because we already said if your money's on the way and hasn't yet arrived, we still count it when we buy the korbanot. It's not like the korbanot we do at the first part of the year are only for the people in Israel. Definitely not. And notice it says not just the Shem Eretz Israel, also the Shem Kol Yisrael. It's like for the people in Israel and everybody. The second one, Shnia l'Shem Krochim Mukafim, for the cities that are surrounding, U'L'Shem or the countries surrounding, U'L'Shem Kol Yisrael, and for everybody. Shlishit, the third one, l'shem Bavel u'Madai, u'l'shem Medinot u'Rechokot, u'l'shem Kol Yisrael. Bavel, Madai, and all the other faraway places, and obviously all of Israel also. It's kind of like our matzahs or Kohen Levi Yisrael, right? These are representative, showing the different parts of the Jewish people. Tani, Natal min harishona, af al pi sheyesh barishona. Now it seems like we're switching. Before we were talking about there's these gigantic kupot where they would collect the money. And then when they did the Trumat Lishka, they would split it into these three that were labeled Aleph, Bet, Gimel. So now it seems like we're talking about those. Natal min harishona. So what happens? You do your Trumat Lishka on the 1st of Nisan, you take from the first big basket, you split it into three other baskets that are each 3 se'ah each. You might have some left over. You cover it with this leather cloth that covers it so that everyone knows you already took from there. Whatever's left is called shirayim, which we'll see there's a bit of a machloket about whether you can use it or not, but we seem to think right now you can't use them anymore for the sacrifices. They can be used for other things, but not that. And then you have these 3 kupot. Now, how do you use these 3 kupot? And here I have to correct something I said yesterday. We said they were labeled Aleph, Bet, Gimel because you have to know what order. But here it's going to be a little different than what I said because the order is going to be like this. It's still going to be Aleph, Bet, Gimel, but I thought yesterday that we use all of Aleph and then we move to Bet. No, it's not exactly that way. So we'll see right now. Natal min harishona, af al pi sheyesh barishona, even though you still have left, notel min hashniya. In other words, you use some of the first, but then you move to the next one. Natal min hashniya, af al pi sheyesh hashniya, notel min hashlishit. Then we want to, again, it's this idea of we're representing that we're taking everybody's coins. I was thinking when I play with one of my daughters, Rummy Cub, so she likes to put all her tiles on one side and my tiles on the other side, and I can't take from her tiles, she can't take from mine. And so, I like to say, well, it's not exactly fair. What if the joker's by you, right? It's sort of this idea that the one that I need is on your side. Now, of course, it's all random, right? Of course, it doesn't make a difference. But the point is that we want everyone to feel like their money was used. Obviously, nobody even knows whose money is where, just like I don't know where the joker is or where the tile that I'm looking for. But the idea is I want to have a fair shot at everything, right? I think it's unfair that way. So likewise here, everyone wants to feel like their money was taken. So every kupa is access so that at least your money was mixed in with the money that got taken and used. And that's why we don't we don't go straight through the whole thing because of this concern. So now, then what happens? So shamash lishi, this is also like a game, right? When, if you play Settlers of Catan, so the first person gets to put theirs out first, then the second, then the third, right? The last person gets to put double, right? And then we go backwards. It's exactly, right? This sounds like a game. So we do, so now what happens? Shamash lishi, chozer lashniya. Then we go backwards, back to the second. Shamash shniya, chozer lavishona. Then we go back to the first. Shamush loshtan. Once you're done with all of them, chozer v'shokel. Now, if you run out of money, well, then you take more money. Now, there's a debate about where we get the money from. Was it money that came, the money we already used for the first one, we can't use anymore. So it must be money that came in since then. Money that was collected after we did the Truma Lishka, we can use that money to add. Rabbi Meir Omer, chozer l'shirayim. He says, what do you mean? You go back to the first kupa that you took from. And the remainder, it's fine to take from there. Shayach Rabbi Meir Omer, now this is a little backwards, but he would say, Mo'alim b'shirayim shema yitztarchu lahem basaf. This just proves that he has no problem taking from the shirayim. He says there's a din of me'ila, misuse of consecrated property, in the remainder. Why? And that's if you say the remainder can't be used, well, then there wouldn't be shirayim. He says maybe you'll need it in the end. And therefore, there is a din of misuse of consecrated property if someone takes that money and uses it for something else, because they might potentially be used if they run out of money from the 3 kupot that they took. So therefore, there's a possibility you can prove from here that clearly he thinks that you can use the shirayim. Okay. We're going to end on these 2 statements about behavior. And it's interesting because, again, we were just talking now about it's like games, and games have to be done in a fair way because people are always jealous of other people or competitive or want, right? You saw Rabban Gamliel, he wanted his coin used. And there's all this concern. And we talked about this when we talked about the temple in general, that there's concern we talked about the person who might go in and steal the money. And there's all this human interaction going on. And because of that, maybe that's why this statement is here. And this very famous line, it comes in different versions in different places. And it's used as the basis for the book Mesilat Yesharim of the Ramchal. Also with a bit of a different, he starts with Zihirut, which doesn't appear in ours. He has a few differences, but anyway, let's read what Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair would say. It's the one with the donkey who wouldn't eat the Truma Masrot, the stuff that wasn't Hufrash Truma Masrot. He himself was a great man, kind of known as the miracle man. Zrizut miviali de nikiyut, doing things quickly and efficiently causes nikiyut, clean from sin. Nikiyut miviali de tahara, cleanliness brings or clean from sin brings tahara, purity. Tahara miviali de kedusha, purity brings sanctity. Kedusha miviali de anava, sanctity brings anava, brings humility. Anava miviali de yirat chet, if you're humble, it will cause fear from sin. Yirat chet miviali de chasidut, that will cause piety if you're fearful of sin. Chasidut, piety miviali de ruach hakodesh, you can get God's presence, like a prophecy. Ruach hakodesh miviali de tchiat hametim, God's, however you would say it, his wind resting upon you brings tchiat hametim, to the resurrection of the dead. And tchiat hametim miviali de Eliyahu hanavi. Tchiat hametim, resurrecting of the dead, brings Eliyahu hanavi, and that's right, going to bring the Mashiach. Okay, so like I said, there's an entire book explaining this. So I'm not going to try to explain what all this means. Okay, we'll read the verses that kind of show the connections. But as I said, Mesilat Yesharim is based on this whole thing, so you can read the whole book about this. So Zrizut miviali de nikiyut. How so? Dechtiv b'chila michaper al hakodesh. Chila means they finished, meaning they finished it quickly, and then it caused kapara, which is atonement, is the cleaning. Nikiyut miviali de tara. Dechtiv v'chiper alea kohen v'tiara. This is by the woman who gives birth. The kohen does his atonement for her. That's nikiyut, and that causes v'tiara. She becomes tahor, pure. Tara miviali de kedusha, dechtiv. This is an avodah of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim, on Yom Kippur. V'tiaro v'kitsho. It says he purifies it and then he sanctifies it. Kedusha miviali de anava, dechtiv. We're now jumping to, I believe, Yeshayahu. Kiko amar ram v'nisa shochen av v'kadosh shemo v'arom v'kadosh eshkon. Right, God dwells high above, sanctity, and then it says ve'etakau shvar ruach. And who's with me? Those who are humble. So kedusha, sanctity, brings humility. Anava miviali de yirat chet, dechtiv ekev anava yirat Hashem. Right, humility is what causes you to fear God. Yirat chet miviali de chasidut, dechtiv b'chesed Hashem me'olam v'yad olam al yire'ah. The chesed of God is on those who fear Him. Chasidut miviali de ruach hakodesh, dechtiv az dibarta b'chazon lechasidecha. Like God spoke to his Hasidim, those who were pious. Ruach HaKodesh mevi'ah lidei tchiat hametim, d'chtiv v'natati ruchi bachem v'chiyitem. It's the Ruach of God. That's why I was having trouble translating exactly Ruach HaKodesh, but the Ruach of God is what's going to bring people back to life. Tchiat hametim mevi'ah lidei Eliyahu zachor l'tov. This was in last week's Haftorah in Shabbat HaGadol. D'chtiv, hinei anochi sholech lachem et Eliyahu hanavi lifnei bo yom Hashem hagadol v'hanora. Okay, and that's in the context there. It talks about Tchiat hametim. Okay, last line. Tana b'shem Rabbi Meir. Kol mi shekavua be'eretz Yisrael u'medaber b'lashon hakodesh v'ochel perotav b'tara v'korei kriyat shema b'boker u'ba'erev yehem mebusar sheben olam haba. They will announce about you that you're going to get olam haba if you do the following things. So what are they? You put your dwelling place in Israel. You speak lashon hakodesh. You speak Hebrew. Ochel perotav b'tara. You take trumot u'maasrot on your fruits. You read Kriyat Shema in the morning and the evening. Those are things that are going to bring olam haba. Okay, you come up with all sorts of theories as to why these things specifically. With that, Hadran alach perek b'shlosha parakim, we finished our chapter. I just want to point out one thing here, that there's a bit of a connection. First of all, we talked a little bit about Truma, but this Lashon HaKodesh, maybe it's a reaction to Rabbi Yishmael, who said alphabet Agama, and that they didn't want any Greek in the temple. Maybe this was a bit of a reaction to that. Okay, in any case, we'll end our chapter here. And we'll start with the new parak tomorrow. I want to say one thing I saw in the chat. They were asking about the Yerushalmi on Sefaria. So it's a bit of an issue. Okay, the Yerushalmi on Sefaria is split into two. Okay, there's a section that goes by daf, and there's a section that goes by chapter. So you have to click where it says daf Yomi, and then you can get the default doesn't go there. It's because when Sefaria did it, they did it all based on the Bavli, so they didn't have the Yerushalmi in their system. So they created a new system, but it's not as simple and easy to use. It's still kind of simple, but it has to be used a little bit differently. And on our site also, we have the Sefaria. So if you want to see the Sefaria by the daf, you can just look at every page right on the Hadran site, and you'll get the Sefaria of that page. Okay, so of today's daf. So that's also an easy way to follow. Have a great day, everybody. Moadim l'simcha, and pick up tomorrow with a new chapter.